Welcome to Our Nation Today. I'm K.R. Davidson. Thanks for joining us as we look at the stories behind the headlines. Provinces and territories across the country are continually assessing their COVID-19 reopening plans. Premier Kenney has stated that Alberta will be following the province's chief medical officer, who has recommended lifting all COVID-19 public health orders, including mandatory self-isolation for those with symptoms. Alberta is the first jurisdiction in Canada to eliminate all COVID-19 safety measures and will continue to do so. With me to discuss this is my co-host, Rachel Gertz. So Alberta's announcement is basically saying even if there's a fourth wave, if the Delta variant comes in, they're going to maintain that the vaccination is their primary means of addressing COVID. And they're basically moving into this place where I think they're trying to bring in this return to normalcy. And then the real question is, can that happen? Are we in this place to be taking a look at some of the tested methods that we've used over the last year, or should we be wholesale abandoning those? But give us a little bit of the facts of this before we hop into these substantive points.
Yeah, so Dr. Hinshaw's recommendation has been that they remove all precautions that they've been using up to this point. And so that would include things like masking, isolation hotels, testing for asymptomatic individuals. And so they're going to be reducing them. They've started a few days ago. This will happen up until August 16th. And from there, they're going to move on to the next step. So what are some of the concerns that people might have with this?
Yeah, well, there's a group of Edmonton doctors that have already published a letter stating that they're not in agreement with the chief medical officers or Premier Kenney's stance on this, and that restrictions need to be put in place. I think that there's some questions of if you're removing some of the testing facilities and that now is shifting over to clinics and doctors' offices, do you want patients with COVID symptoms going in there? But of course, I think we're all now used to a bit of a hybrid model. I haven't gone to a doctor since COVID. I speak to them on the telephone. So the question is, what are you going to have full waiting rooms like you did before? But at its core, I think one of the things we have to take a look at is, are we going to be looking at COVID-19 as dealing with it as a pandemic, or is it something that's here to stay where we have to take a look at different models and such?
Well, that's something that the health minister discussed, talking about the idea of when you have this, starts out as a pandemic, you work in containment and mitigation, and then you move to endemic. So how do you deal with it in the day-to-day? So I think that what some people are questioning is this wholesale canceling of all these restrictions, is this the right move?
Yeah, and so I think that there's two parts to take a look at. Obviously, we know of the restrictive practices that have been employed, and I almost take a look at the poster childs of restrictive versus least restrictive. You probably have Quebec and such that might be more restrictive, or Newfoundland, and then you've got Alberta, which has been trying to get away from these restrictions from the beginning. But I think if we actually shift the model over and we actually start to take a look at what does it mean to be able to operate with a comprehensive plan, not one that's just looking at COVID as the preeminent concern, but the indirect effects that have come from COVID, the effects on child development, mental health issues, substance abuse, et cetera.
Well, I think these are some of the issues that have brought division around even relationships too, right? So there's so many varying opinions on these things. People are concerned about, are we just getting back to the economy because it's a bottom, dollar kind of thing, or are we still going to take care of people?
Yeah, and if we're taking a look at where Premier Kenney's going, I'm sure he's eyeing an election in 2 years. He's taking a look at the economy in Alberta as something that he promised to be able to get back in good order, and of course he's not doing that. His polling is bottomed out at 29%. I think he only sees that there's a means to go upwards if he can get the economy on track. So there's other priorities. But to speak to your point more specifically, I think that this has been a great divide in Canada. And the question is, how do we actually start to unify? We've dealt with great divides before. How do we start to come together so we're not polarized on this subject? Many are now stating that COVID-19 is here to stay. And the question now needs to shift on how to address the virus from viewing it rather from a pandemic to the context of an endemic. With the fully vaccinated levels for eligible persons in Canada reaching 63%, there needs to be a focus on efforts on protecting those that are immune compromised. And a comprehensive strategy needs to be adopted that addresses the indirect effects of COVID-19 in areas such as child development, mental health, substance abuse, waiting list, and supporting those workers and businesses that have been affected by the restrictions that have been imposed. Moreover, Canadians need to unite to bridge any divide the very views of the virus have presented within our families. Stay with us. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. The federal government has reached an $8 billion settlement with First Nations in a class action suit filed on behalf of a number of First Nations communities who are stating that they lack access to clean drinking water. The settlement is being hailed as a historic agreement between the nations and the federal government, with compensation for damages and monies for future work for lifting boil water advisories in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Okay, so this is a decade-long lawsuit and $8 billion, not a small amount of money by any stretch of the imagination. But this is part of the Liberal platform to promise by 2021 that there will be no more advisories in First Nations or Indigenous communities. Of course, they haven't reached that, and we can talk about that more specifically. But give us just a bit of an overview on this concept of drinking water concerns in our Indigenous communities.
Well, I think when you look at it from a global perspective, a lot of people talk about drinking water being a basic human right. And some of the questions that people have is, we've literally put people into space. Why is it that in 2021, there are still people in Canada that don't have clean water?
Yeah, I think that is the question of the day. And when we even take a look at fundamentally, where's the disconnect here? We're taking a look in Canada. We wake up, we take it for granted that we have clean drinking water, and in large part, it's because our regimes are structured under provincial governments, and we have enforcement mechanisms. There's a lot of boil water advisories in provinces, not just in Indigenous communities, but the ones that are Indigenous communities are much higher risk. We're actually taking a look at diseases are at a higher rate and such. And the question is, what has the federal government done to be able to put these structures in place to be able to cure this?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important is to think about how many communities they are, how spread out they are. Some of these are very small, and so it's not like one concentrated place where everything can just be fixed. But what's really interesting is this interaction between the federal government and our Indigenous people, and then the provincial government and our water safety. What does that mean? How does that all work together?
Well, when I take a look at it, so under the Harper government, they brought in Bill S8, which is this clean drinking water for Indigenous communities. It was long awaited. Some say that it was rammed through. But what's needed is this cooperation between the federal government and the Indigenous communities to be able to enact regulation. They actually don't have regulation like what we have here. So your standards are going to drop lower, specifically when we're taking a look at what is required for operators to adhere to, and then even the training of our operators, and then how we cure some of these things. Even when we take a look in First Nation communities, their operators are paid 30% less than other areas, and they don't have enough employees. So there needs to be the adoption of practices from what we see as our best practices in provincial communities and have those brought over into Indigenous communities.
And so we have the Indigenous Services Canada, something that, I think probably asking how does some of this get implemented, who takes care of it. Indigenous Services Canada has essentially told the communities to take whatever the highest level of regulation is, whether that's provincially or if there's anything federally. But how do they actually play into this? What are they responsible for? Because I think people are saying, well, where does the responsibility lie? So what does Indigenous Services Canada have to do with it?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So basically, Indigenous communities are responsible for 20% of the costs associated with water or clean water, and the federal government's responsible for 80%. And basically, we've seen that the federal government's responsible for this area, primarily Indigenous communities, but there hasn't been the cooperation with the leadership of the communities to bring in these regulations and to deal with appropriate enforcement mechanisms, and even on the awareness and the education to be able to say, hey, these are important issues that have to be dealt with, and maybe some of our child health issues are actually tied directly to this. And so the federal government needs to make greater steps to be able to address this. And I think at the end of the day, there just has to be real leadership to say this has to be done, and rather than just having it as a list on the priority list.
Yeah, well, I think some people are going to say, if it hasn't happened yet, why are we still bothering? Why are we still trying? And there's other people that are saying, well, it's a human rights issue. Why don't we keep going?
Well, the reality is there has been progress over the last 5 years. So, the time is now to be able to say there has to be real regulation, and it has to be in cooperation with our Indigenous communities. So there are some things in life that we likely take for granted, and for the most of us in Canada, drinking clean water is likely one of those. However, this has not been the case for some of those living in our northern communities, specifically our Indigenous communities. In 2021, it is high time that a regulatory regime is established that allows for sufficient support to allow for the training and equipping of operators to ensure that the basics that we enjoy with our clean water are realized throughout Canada, especially in our north. Stay with us. When we return, we'll be looking at how the German gymnast team decided to combat sexualization in the sport by way of a change of uniform. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. The Tokyo Olympics have had to deal with operating under constrained conditions as a result of COVID-19, which has come with a host of changes. But one of the recent changes that has emerged is not related with COVID. German gymnast, in a statement against the sexualization of the sport, donned ankle-length unitards as opposed to traditional bikini-cut uniforms, which is a shot against the custom that is normative in the sport. And the German gymnasts are not alone in breaking out of this uniformity. A week before this, the female Norwegian handball team decided to wear shorts rather than bikini bottoms in their match against Spain, which resulted in the team being fined for breaching the uniform policy. So this is obviously an interesting topic. We see with the Norwegian team that their actual organization in Norway ended up paying for that. We actually saw Pink came up, said that she would pay for the fine. This is actually cast a light on something that probably should have been dealt with beforehand. A lot of support for both the German gymnast and the Norwegian handball team. Give us a bit of background on what this story is about.
Yeah, both of these examples are really highlighting something that women, work with in sport all the time, and they have for a very long time. You go back to look at some of the tennis rules, from 100, 150 years ago. It's unfortunate, but even in 2021, there still persists this sexualization of women in their uniform and their dress versus men in sport.
Okay, so and it's interesting, and we're going to get into this in a little later on with this battle between monetization and how that sometimes equates to sexualization. But give us just the facts of what happened with the German team and the Norwegian handball team, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so with the women's team, that actually happened a couple weeks before what happened with the German team, and so they had been trying, I think, since 2006. They've been appealing to the European Federation to say, why can't we wear shorts? People aren't comfortable in this. This is, highly sexualized. There's actually a demand on, the angle that the bikini needs to be cut and that the sides can't be, as large. And so they've been actually appealing this since 2006. So they decided in a very kind of quiet way of protest that they were going to wear shorts. And when you compare it to what the men, what their counterparts are required to wear, it's tank tops and shorts as long as it's, quote, not too baggy. So we see a big discrepancy. And so they decided to do this.
And then what happened with the German
And then
gymnast?
with the German team, so that was a bit of a break in the rules. What Germany did was a bit of a break in tradition and what's expected. So in many recent years, women are wearing high-cut bikini leotards, and they decided to opt for the full body suit, just as a way to say, look at our sport and not our bodies.
Okay, so I think almost everybody is in agreement with the Norwegian handball team and the German gymnasts. And in fact, they actually seem like they actually had the spotlight. If I'm going to be frank, their full-length unitards were actually very interesting just as a uniform in and of itself. But when we're taking a look at what needs to happen to combat the sexualization in this area, what are you seeing? What are some of the remedies in this area?
Yeah, I think in some places it's representation. There are governing bodies that, for instance, are made up of 25 people and only 2 of them are women. But I think we also need to look at, there has to be a general shift of including some of the athletes, allowing them to have a say. And, there's always this tension between, the kind of tradition and these bodies and how sport is. And, how do we make those changes without being disruptive to kind of what we rely on as this security of the sport?
Okay, so when you're talking about the security of the sport, what's so important about the security of sport, specifically when it comes to uniforms?
So one of the things that sport does in general Obviously there are other factors, but sport a lot of times has allowed people of all different demographics to come together and to prove themselves just based on skill. We've seen that with the case of Michael Orr and some other people who have really been able to demonstrate that. And so one of the things that uniform does on top of that is it adds another level of equalization. So it just allows people to say, here's my sport, here's my skill. Don't look at my body. That's not what this is about. And so there's a tension there to say that's really important, but at the same time, how do we challenge some of these things if we've been talking for 15 years and there's been no action?
Yeah, and part of this comes down to who are the governing bodies? Is there sufficient representation, even from a gender perspective, on the governing bodies to be able to enact the appropriate rules? Because we knew the European Federation actually said it was the IHF rules, as if they didn't have some ability to deal with that. So sports is noted as the great equalizer, and the continued appreciation and protection of this quality of the game need not be understated. Whether it is based on gender, race, one's belief, or their economic status, sports has been heralded as the great leveler, and a continual effort must be taken to ensure that the ability to successfully monetize our sports does not come at the expense of the dignity of those that participate. The finding of the Norwegian handball team has shone a light on an area that beckons reform, not only of the rules, but maybe of the rule makers. Stay with us. When we return, we'll be looking at a historic criminal trial in the Vatican. Welcome back to Our Nation Today. A cardinal and 9 others are part of the largest criminal trial in the Vatican's modern history. The charges relate to embezzlement and the mismanagement of a real estate investment in London. Pope Francis modified the church's law, removing the cardinal's immunity, which would have prohibited a lay tribunal from prosecuting the senior Vatican official. The case has recently adjourned until October, but is set to continue well into 2022. So I'm sure it is set to go into 2022. There's going to be over 250 witnesses. Just the amount of the pleadings or the indictment in this was, I think, 6,000 pages, not even talking about some of the other
And the supporting
evidence.
material, 28,000.
Yeah, it's crazy. So a huge issue, but to have a cardinal indicted is something in and of itself.
Well, this is groundbreaking, and I think it causes people to ask a lot of questions. So first of all, this institution, like the finances that they're overseeing and how those are being overseen and what some of the rules are and those kind of things are questions I think people are asking. How could this happen?
Yeah, so when we're taking a look at this, Cardinal Becciu was responsible for the management of some of the Vatican's funds and their investments. We have to understand his role. He was basically the chief of staff to the Pope before. Pope Francis elevated him in 2018 to the position of cardinal. And so there was an investment of about 350 million euros, which is about 520 million Canadian dollars in real estate development in Chelsea. And obviously there's questions of whether these funds were going to the right places. In fact, there appears that they were using some of the funds, obviously personally and otherwise, but some of them they said were marked to actually deal with addressing hostage ransom of Catholic missionaries and such. So just these oddities to the story everywhere.
Yeah, it's super bizarre. But I think to understand it better, I think there's part of it where we're going, what law is being followed in these proceedings, right? This is in the Vatican City State, but then they're inside of Italy. What's some of that? How do we understand some of that?
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's actually part of the interesting part. The lawyers for the defendants, I think there's 20 plus defendants here, 10 lawyers. A lot of them are actually citing Italian law, and they're being told by the prosecutor, listen, this does not apply because canon law applies.
So what's some of the difference between canon law and maybe some of what we see throughout the rest of the world?
It would be no different than actually seeing what law you have in a civil jurisdiction versus a common law. They're actually just completely different laws and must be interpreted in accordance with whatever that presiding law is. So canon law is written law. It's part of the Roman Catholic Church. If you read it, it reads just like you would read your criminal code here, but in a different measure. It actually deals with not only criminal matters, but it actually deals with the conduct of how diocese and priests are to operate within those particular settings.
Okay, so we see some of these alleged abuses and what's being investigated. I think one thing would be interesting to know is how much are these guys making? I mean, the people that are set to oversee these amounts of money.
Well, it depends if you include their extracurricular funds.
Or not.
Okay, so Pope Francis in April 29th of this year actually brought out new regulations saying priests or anybody within the Vatican cannot accept any gifts over 40 euros. Okay, so this is something we see somewhat consistent with government officials, not something that we've seen before. In fact, it was common practice to, give Christmas gifts and otherwise to some of these officials. And so there's a radical change there. And when you're taking a look, a priest in the Catholic Church makes between $25,000 and $35,000 a year. A cardinal makes $68,000. These are not high-paying jobs, but of course, there's great reasons probably for that. The Pope doesn't make anything. In fact, the Pope gets 3 coins a year, a silver, a bronze, and a gold one, and he doesn't even get those until he dies. Those are put in his casket.
So kind of like another official head of state, which is important to mention, I think. The Pope is head of the church, but also head of the Vatican.
Yeah, and that's an important point here because it was the Pope's move in this part that actually removed the immunity for the cardinal to be prosecuted. Normally, cardinals could only be prosecuted or tried by other cardinals, and in this case, the chief prosecutor against the mafia is actually the head jurist in this. So that's interesting. We've got more to talk about on this in the weeks ahead. Pope Francis has promised to deal with the corruption in the Vatican since his election as Pope. And the step that he has taken to permit these proceedings is a clear message that the days of unchecked corruption in the halls of the Vatican should be no more. Noted author C.S. Lewis stated, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." In days gone past, it would have been easier for the Catholic Church to sweep something like this under the rug. Well, this is not the only problem that the Church is dealing with. It is promising to see that this trial and the recent reforms in the Vatican are dealing a blow to an area that has undoubtedly tarred the historic institution. Both Rachel and I would like to thank you for watching Our Nation Today. Remember, keep examining. Know that you are part of the solution.